Welcome to Finding Family DNA, the show about finding and connecting birth families, with your host, Jay Rosenzweig, founder and CEO of BirthParentFinder.com. And now, here's Jay.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Finding Family DNA. I'm your host, Jay Rosenzweig, the founder and CEO of BirthParentFinder.com. And we have a really great episode today. We're bringing in a transracial adoptee born in China, and we'll bring her in a minute, but I want to welcome our co-host, Misty. Misty, we had a busy week, didn't we?
Yes, we did. We had a very busy Easter.
And you want to tell our audience what happened on Sunday with 3 cases specifically, and I believe at least 2 of them were cold cases, right?
Yes, so we had one case where we had an individual who was born to a Vietnamese mother who immigrated over to the United States. The only thing that she knew was that she herself, the adoptee, was born in Los Angeles in 1976. Her mother was born in 1951 in Vietnam, and when her mother came over to the States, she brought a 7-year-old daughter with her. And so she had a name for her biological mother, and I had to research everybody in the United States with that name who matched the details of her story, and I was successfully able to identify her mother and her sister this weekend.
And we weren't sure if this case would get solved, and this wasn't a DNA solve, was it?
No, this is strictly investigative research.
And it's really good that we have that capability of doing that also, in addition to doing DNA investigation, right?
Right.
So what was the other one?
So we had 2 more. We had a woman that was born in 96 in California, and she was seeking her biological father. She knows absolutely nothing about him, but she took an ancestry test and she matched to a half first cousin. I spent tons of time reaching out to that family and nobody would get back to me. But then through the power of Jay, you tried to reach out and you got her suspected birth father on the phone in about 30 seconds. And now we're working on getting that file closed out.
And it really comes down to patience, right, Misty?
It does.
And we're going to be talking about that with our guest today also. But before we do that, one episode that I think our audience, if they haven't already seen it, was episode 7. I know, Misty, you were not involved with episode 7, Ania Elmore, and she was an adoptee from South Korea. And we were hired by a reality TV show called This Time Next Year, which I don't think they have anymore. I think it's still in Europe, but not in the US. And our job was to find the birth father who was a soldier in Korea. And we found him, and then I was out of my hands because the TV show took it over. And then years later, I found out from Ania that she took an ancestry DNA test, and the DNA test showed nothing, no Korean relatives to find her birth mother. And then years later, a first cousin showed up from Korea, and that first cousin happened to be in the United States. And that first cousin told her, hey, your birth mother's in the US now. And they connected. And if you want to see that, go watch episode 7. It's really compelling. I had nothing to do with her finding her birth mother, but that was great. And that just goes to show you, and we'll get into that with our guest, that patience is so important, and taking an ancestry DNA test is important. On that note, I would love to welcome our guest, Taylor Shennett, who is a Chinese-born adoptee who came here when she was, I believe, 1 year old. And Taylor, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. I just want to start out by asking you to tell your story and when you first found out that you were adopted. I know it wouldn't take that long, considering you don't look like your birth family, but when did you really first find out and have that conversation with your parents?
Yeah, so my name's Taylor. I was adopted around 9 months old. And growing up, I always knew I was adopted. But my mom remembers this one moment. We were in the car. I was maybe 2, maybe 3. And I asked very clearly, like, why do I have black eyes and why do you have blue eyes? And that was the first time that my mom realized that we would have to talk about my adoption at such an early age. And so growing up, I knew I was adopted. I knew I was different. And because of that, it made me very curious about where I came from or who I belonged to.
And that's interesting. At 2 years old, you said?
Yeah, that's what she says, which for her, it was a little bit of a shock too, because at the time I didn't speak very clearly. And so she had trouble understanding me sometimes. And so my sister, who's a little bit younger than me, was like my translator. And she was the one who normally spoke for me, but that one sentence I was able to say and she understood without my sister having to help.
And we're going to get into that in a minute, but I do want to tell our audience that how I found you. I found you. A lot of stuff comes across my newsfeed being in this business. And I saw your story of your adoption and that you are, and also an adoptee advocate. You're a social media influencer and you're pretty big in this business. So I said, I got to have her on this show. And again, thank you for being here. But why don't you start from the beginning and tell your story of your adoption?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be on here. But my adoption started years ago. My parents were told that at the time they couldn't have children. Adoption was always something they were interested in. And so they immediately pivoted and started looking more into adoption. And at the time, they were a little bit open on where they were going to adopt. And my aunt saw a documentary or a news story on China and the one child policy and the amount of baby girls that were there in the orphanage. And so she showed my parents, and they immediately felt like that was where they wanted to adopt from. And so they started the adoption process, and halfway through, they became pregnant with my little sister, who is only 7 months younger than me. So we call each other Belton twins. She was born 2 months before I came home. And so pretty much from the very beginning of her life and for my memories, she's always been in my life. And we're best friends now. But growing up, I had phases of my life where I was really interested in my adoption, and other phases of my life where it was something I felt embarrassed about. It made me different from my family. I'm the only adoptee in my entire family. And so at family gatherings, at family dinners, anytime, I was always reminded I was adopted, not because of my family, but just because I would look around the table and I didn't look like them. Or we would talk about how the day my cousins were born or my sister was born, and I didn't have that story. I didn't have any of those moments. And so that made me feel self conscious of my adoption. It felt like that's something I couldn't talk about. And it really wasn't until my freshman year of high school that I really started talking about my adoption. And by my junior year, I started being more public about those feelings. And now that's evolved into the social media platform I have to this day. And I really love sharing my story because I want people to see all the different sides of adoption and hear from adoptee voices. And I feel very strongly about empowering other adoptees in sharing their voice or doing birth parent searches or going back to their country of origin, things like that, because I feel like there's not many people encouraging them to do that. And so many parents disagree or feel like that's not something that should be celebrated or considered. And so I just try to encourage other adoptees out there that they're not alone.
So where did you grow up?
I grew up a little bit everywhere. Philadelphia and Memphis, Tennessee are really where I claim my hometowns to be.
And was your dad in the military?
No, we just ended up moving a lot for different jobs that he had.
So being a transracial adoptee, looking different from a lot of people, especially your family, um, well, I'm sure there's racism everywhere. Where was it worse, Philadelphia or Tennessee?
Honestly, Memphis was really good. There's so much history with racial divide in Memphis already that as an Asian American, I felt very comfortable there. But I will say that during the rise of COVID, really 2020 with the rise of Asian hate crimes, that's when I really had to sit and be okay with my Chinese identity. That was the first time that I really felt conflicted or felt embarrassed to be Chinese. I remember being scared going out to grocery stores or doing things because I felt like people were just going to judge me. And that was the first time I really felt racism on that scale.
I forgot about that. I realized I live in Los Angeles. Misty lives outside of Chicago, and we have a lot of Asians in our community. Tons of Chinese, tons of Thai, tons of Vietnamese. But in certain communities, I remember people were yelling at Chinese people saying, "You caused COVID." It's like, oh my God. And that did exist. I actually forgot about that. That was what, 6 years ago?
Yeah, yeah, 6 years ago, and I remember, like, going to a grocery store and an older gentleman, like, pulled his mask down and, like, coughed on me, and that moment really stuck in my head because I was like, why would you do that? Like, that's so gross. And I was like, oh, it's because I'm Asian. And he just sees an Asian. And I remember having a conversation with my parents at that time, talking about my fears, especially as a transracial adoptee. And they were like, it's fine. No one sees you that way. And I had to tell them, like, respectfully, like, they do see me that way. The world sees me as an Asian woman. They don't see me as your daughter. They don't know that I have a whole white family behind me. Like, I'm Chinese. And so that led to us talking, having really great conversations, just like about race and our different perspectives and how the world views me differently. And that kind of segued into also me talking about transracial adoption a little bit more on my page, because so often, years ago, when people were doing transracial adoptions, they were always told to do like the colorblind approach of just saying, like, oh, just say them like you love them and you don't see color and you don't see race. And now it's like that is so wrong. And you should be able to see that, because there's so many world issues that different perspectives, are needed, and you need to prepare your child for that.
There's so many facets to our identity that unfortunately are based off our skin color and our ethnic
Intimate.
background, and to ignore that takes away so much from somebody's personal identity and who they are.
Yes, agreed.
So, how close are you with your sister?
Very close. She's one of my best friends, but growing up, there were times that we weren't close. For a long time, I felt very jealous of her. I felt very insecure that my biological parents could give me up, but our parents obviously did not give her up. And so I felt very self-conscious that I was in the position where I felt like I had to earn my place in the home, and she just got it. And so that led to a lot of jealousy and resentment just on my end, not even on my sister's, which was really hard to work through, but I've gotten through that now.
Was there a competition between the two of you?
In my mind, yes. In my sister's mind, no. But I'm also a very competitive person. So if you tell me to do anything, I want to be the first one. I want to like be on top. And my sister is not competitive, but just because of that jealousy, I did feel like I had to compete for our parents' love or attention, which again wasn't reality, but just how I viewed the situation.
Did you ever outwardly express that to your family, or was that something you internalized yourself?
It was a lot of internalization, and I had a really hard time talking about my feelings. I would always resort to, like, I'm mad, I'm sad, but I never really wanted to dive deeper into them.
Mm.
And it really wasn't until my mom got us a journal that I would like write down my feelings and she would write a response that I started opening up. And when I first started talking about my adoption publicly, it felt easier telling the whole world my thoughts and feelings on my adoption than it did telling my parents face to face. And it wasn't until maybe 2 years of creating content online that I started feeling more comfortable talking to my parents about my feelings. And we started doing more research, and, more things became available for us to read, that dove deeper into like the psychology behind adoptees and the trauma and all of that, that really opened all of our minds. That my whole family says, we wish we had those resources when we first adopted, because that would have helped us when you were a teen and struggling with these things, and we didn't know what to say other than like, no, of course you're ours, like we love you just the same. And going to a adoptee therapist really helped, because they were able to talk directly to those fears and not give me those blanket answers that, at the time you're like, of course I know I'm loved, but
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that doesn't help.
Right.
So the
Well, that's
adopt
good. I always try to
go ahead.
recommend to our clients too that are struggling with those internal feelings is seek out a specific adoption focused therapist, because they will understand to be able to navigate those feelings with you, and the things that you internalize, and be able to help you express them to the people you love and care about.
Yes, for sure.
So getting back to the adoptee therapist, and we've worked with several of them, and some of them are also adopted. So was your therapist also adopted?
So I wish my therapist was adopted. My therapist at the time was an adoptive mother who also did training in adoption related trauma and things like that, which helped me. Now, as an adult, I'd probably prefer an adoptee therapist. I think that would have been probably the best scenario. But earlier in my life, I did go to like a therapist and a counselor, and they were just like general family therapists or things like that. And again, blanket answers, they're nice, but not didn't help me with those fears.
And there's good and bad to both. I mean, I've seen the good and bad with an adoptee therapist and a non-adoptee therapist. And where I wouldn't recommend an adoptee therapist is if that particular therapist has her own or his own major trauma. That could be a problem. And I've seen that. It's like that trauma should have no effect on their clients.
Mm-hmm.
But so how old were you when you started seeing a therapist?
I think I first started maybe when I was 12 or so, and then I stopped by the time I was early 20s. And at that point, I felt very fulfilled, very okay with everything going on. Um, but who knows? I might go back to one.
And you obviously had a lot of questions about why you were placed for adoption. Who was your birth mother? What information did the agency or the orphanage have on her? Were you given any of that information or no?
No. So, because of the circumstances of being a girl, being born during China's one child policy, the most orphanages don't have any information to give you. And so my family and we went back to my orphanage back in 2016. We were able to see the files, and the files had nothing new. It was just copies of all the paperwork that my parents had. And when we met with the orphanage director that was working there at the time I was there, he just seemed very shady. And it wasn't until years later that One Child Nation on Amazon Prime came out, and they talked about how many illegal things were happening in China during the one child policy, which we knew, but it also went deeper into babies were being taken from one province to another and being sold to orphanages. Parents were told that their babies were born alive. There's just so many different layers that I truly believe. And from seeing other adoptees find their biological families, there are so many families out there that just don't know where their daughters are. They think it's a lost cause. They don't even know that they're alive and healthy or they were adopted outside of China. So it's really difficult trying to navigate the few paperworks I have.
And what year were
Yeah,
you
that's
born?
1996.
Okay, and then I know now you can't even come close to adopting a child from China in this country. It's non-existent.
No. Yeah.
Right. What I want to do is I want to show, we didn't show this, the video of your father coming to get you in China. We have a clip of that. You sent it to me. I want to show that right now. That was so heartwarming. That was also on the news, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah. A news outlet saw it and thought it was really sweet. So they had my dad and I on the show.
Yeah, that's so heartwarming. 1996. So when did you start becoming a content creator? 2012 was it?
Oof, kind of 2012. I really started on TikTok and Instagram more 2019, 2020, somewhere around there.
So what I want to do now is I want to take a quick break. And when we come back from the break, we're going to talk to Taylor about her journey to try to find her birth mother. This is Jay Rosenzweig, the founder and CEO of BirthParentFinder.com. Sometimes the missing piece of your life is a person you've never met. For over 2 decades, our team of expert investigators and genealogists at BirthParentFinder.com has relied on the power of DNA and genetic genealogy to reconnect thousands of families separated by time, distance, and circumstance. Visit BirthParentFinder.com and begin your journey today. Your family isn't lost, it's waiting to be found. We're back with our guest, Taylor Shennett, who is an adoptee from China, born in 1996. And now I want to ask Taylor about what steps have you taken to try to find your family, birth family?
Yeah, so I've been searching for the past 10 years. I classify it in two different portions. One as active searching, which it would be when we went in person, and then the other is passive, just having my DNA out there. But I first started in 2016, where we went in person to Hunan. we were able to visit my orphanage, and some of my friends put my story out on WeChat, which is the Chinese version of social media. It went viral, and several families were interested. Two families came forward. One was a father missing his daughter, and we did a DNA test, and that was not it. And then another was a family. They had two daughters, and their third daughter was stolen by the government. And they came and visited us. They spent the entire visit saying how much I looked like the mother and that it was uncanny resemblance. And then the moment we asked them to do a DNA test, they declined and very quickly told us it was the wrong dates. I wasn't theirs. This was all a mistake, and they left. And that was the last time we ever heard from them. So we're really not sure what that was. But I've also done a poster search where I was working with an organization called the Nanching Project, and they had over 450 adoptees from Hunan participate, and they put all of our names, our baby photos, and our current photos, and then basic information on a poster, and then hung that all around Hunan and put it on Hunan social media pages, things like that. More recently, I participated in the National Reunion Database, which recently opened up for Chinese adoptees. Previously, it was only open for Chinese people who thought they were kidnapped or they were missing a baby, not for adoptees, but they just opened it up for adoptees. So I submitted my DNA through that. And I also am working with a police officer in Hunan who's trying to do facial recognition, where I sent them photos of myself and they're trying to run it through like the police database, but I haven't heard back on that. And then there was just a family that came forward last week that thought I was their daughter. But when we did the DNA test, it came back negative.
And
Wow,
that,
you've done a lot of different facets of investigation for this. That's amazing.
Yeah.
and Misty, it's amazing that they even volunteered to do DNA testing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really, really neat. Especially the facial recognition. That is astounding. That's amazing.
And I know you do.
Yeah, there was.
Go ahead. So I was going to say, Misty uses that in her other business with the cold cases.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. Yeah, one of another adoptee, I don't know how she was able to get the police officer to do facial recognition, but she was able to find her identical twin through that. And so that's why the police officer then felt comfortable doing it for other Hunan adoptees. But I think they only accepted about like 20 or 30 of us. But I
Right.
haven't heard back. So I'm not sure if they're only running the facial recognition through like the one province or overall of China or how long.
Right.
So what DNA test did you take?
So I've done 23andMe, which I've uploaded to, I believe, like GED Match, WeGene, 23 which are like all Chinese testing companies. And then I also did the blood test with China, but that only tests for parental matches. So if you have any siblings that also enter, it won't give you any notice that you've matched with them, only for parental matches.
And on the 23andMe test, what was the closest relative?
I believe it was like a fourth cousin, like 0.8% DNA shared. I tried connecting with them. They never responded. But I have over 500 DNA relatives on 23andMe, but all of them are very distant. So because I don't know what side of the family that fourth cousin is, I didn't know where to go from there.
Nah.
And Misty will tell you that that's practically impossible to solve, isn't it?
I've worked a couple Asian genetic cases, and the matches do tend to be quite distant. And because they're so distant, it's a lot harder because we don't have access to the repository of records that we do in the States to build those family trees and identify those family lines.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, with China, right before my generation, they were encouraging families to have multiple children. And so before the 1980s babies, everyone was having multiple children. And then immediately, once the one child policy was enforced, everyone cut down. And so even harder that.
Less relatives out there, yeah.
So Taylor, why didn't you take an ancestry test?
So honestly, I did do the process of doing an ancestry test. I was working with a TV show that wanted me to come on, and then I did the ancestry test. I sent it in, and they were like, "We're gonna process it," and then no word. The producer stopped talking to me. I never got any login information. I never got a kit, or like I never got anything from that. So I might have an account, but if I do, I don't know how to even access that. Yeah, the TV show just completely evaporated.
That's awful. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
I was really disappointed.
those shows come and go. They very successful in the UK for some reason, but when those shows are done here, they don't do well. Um,
Mm.
but I want to tell you that yesterday I went to the post office and I sent you an Ancestry DNA kit.
Amazing, thank
You're
you.
welcome, and you'll probably get it on the weekend. You do the spit test, send it back to them, and the results are what, Misty, like up to 6 weeks?
Yeah, right now it's slower. It's about 8 weeks right now.
I wonder why, because in January and February, we got them back quick, didn't we?
Yeah, but I think with possibly they had a lot of sales. Like, remember they were marking the kits down to like $29, $39. So I think there was a huge rush of people going out and buying them.
Right, and they were selling them at Roots Tech for 39, and they sold
Yeah.
out. They sold out of the kits.
Yeah.
So what I was saying before at the beginning of the show, that patience is so important, and all it takes is one U.S. match to possibly solve your case. So in your case, we're hoping for when you get the results back and you'll share them with us. If there's one U.S. match, even a second cousin, that really does help possibly identify one side of your family. And I have hope. I mean, Misty, we've seen this before, even with adoptees from Africa. There's always one person who moves to the U.S. and for some reason takes a DNA test, and the rest is history. And we usually don't take cases that are out of the country unless a really close DNA match shows up. And there's a lot of luck involved, right, Misty? It really is.
Yeah. Luck
And
and patience.
yeah. So, and I personally, I have hope. I'm sure Taylor, you're a religious person, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. I am. And, you're talking about patience and hope. I've been doing it for 10 years now. So at this point, I'm like, what's a few more years? It's fine.
Right.
At least I'm doing it.
That's a great attitude.
And right. So in this meantime, talk about your advocacy. What is your advocacy all about?
Mostly my advocacy is just about sharing the adoptee voice. Previously, I even want to say maybe even 8, 10 years ago, when you looked up adoption, it was always adoption agencies or adoptive parents, and they were the ones talking about adoption and what it meant and how amazing it is. And there were really no adoptees speaking about their experience. And now, thankfully, there are tons of adoptees sharing their own voices and their own stories. But at the time, I really wanted to share my adoption from an adoptee's perspective. And I also felt really passionate about sharing what adoption looks like, the good and the bad, because so often I get comments on my page when I'm talking, about my parents or my adoption in a good light, saying like, "Oh, thank goodness you're one of the good ones, like you're one of the grateful ones and stuff." And it's like, no, an adoptee, it's a complex story, and I can be curious about my biological family and still love my adopted family. I can do all these things and still want to be curious, or there's so much nuance in adoption that I wanted to share that with the world. And I wanted to just be very open about my experience. So really my advocacy is just sharing my adoptee voice and empowering other adoptees to do the same.
And you mentioned that when you were a little girl, you felt possibly unworthy at some point. What
Yes.
changed all that?
Honestly, it was some of my religion, but also just realizing that I didn't have to earn my parents' love. It was the combination of therapy, being able to talk about my adoption, being able to learn more about my adoption. When I was little, I didn't know much about the one child policy, and I had so much anger towards my birth parents because in my mind at the time, I thought they made a decision. They had me, and then they made the decision to leave me. And as I started learning more about the one child policy, I realized that most women during that time didn't have a choice.
Mhm.
Whether that was their spouse telling them what to do, or their in-laws telling them what to do, or the government, or them being kidnapped or stolen or whatever, these women didn't have a choice. And so that anger towards my biological parents just dissipated because I realized that it was so much more complex than they didn't want me. And I realized it wasn't about me, it was just about like what was going on. Now, of course, I don't know the full story and I won't until I find my biological
Mhm.
family. So maybe that is the case. Maybe it was like, no, no, we really did not need you. Who knows? But I still like to think that maybe it wasn't, and maybe there is something deeper. And listening to biological mothers online and hearing their perspective has been very healing to me, because I'm able to hear some of the thoughts and feelings they have then and now.
So we deal with a lot of adoption trauma with our clients, and we vet all our clients. Linda, who takes all the new cases in, wants to make sure the client is in the right frame of mind before we take their case. And I see it in some of the clients. They want to blame their birth parents, and I feel, well, we don't know the story. What are you going to blame them for? Your birth mother basically gave you life. She, in your case, gave you a great life. You have great adopted parents. She could have kept you. You could have been imprisoned. You could have been human trafficked. And in my opinion, she saved your life. You believe that?
I do. In China, there's so many illegal things occurring that if she really didn't want me, things would have happened well before I was born. And so for that, I'm very grateful for the life I have. And I think for a lot of adoptees, we mourn that the what could have been, but that doesn't necessarily mean we wish we had that life. It just means our lives could have been different. And it's okay to wonder about that. But in the end, I love my life. I love my family. I love where I am and the opportunities, my adoption provided me. I wouldn't change that personally.
So, Misty, do you see any similarities between Taylor's case and any of our other thousands of cases that we've had as far as her journey and how she feels about being a transracial adoptee?
I actually do. We've had probably a handful of transracial adoptees, clients that have come to us to find their biological families. And there definitely is that undercurring theme of not feeling like you exactly fit in. Like this is your family and you know your family and your family loves you, but there's that very blatant either skin color or ethnicity difference within the family and overcoming that. And I think it's really admirable that you're an advocacy for letting people know that it's okay to feel that way. It doesn't, change anything about you or your family that you have those feelings. It's completely natural and it's completely human. And as a society, we should recognize that because hopefully that advocacy will pour into families that are looking to adopt. And if they do adopt somebody of a different race or ethnicity than their own, they will have the tools to understand the trauma and the things that their adopted child may experience.
Yeah, that is something that I really hope that people gain from viewing my content, is just the tools, and the understanding, if they are interested in adoption, what to expect and how to approach some of these conversations, so it's not just like a total blindside experience.
Right, exactly.
So, Taylor, what message would you give your younger self or another adoptee that's much younger?
The main message I would give myself is just to be patient and to forgive yourself, and to just take time wherever your journey is. I feel like a lot of people try to tell adoptees what we should or shouldn't be doing or feeling. And it is so important for the adoptee to have space to feel what they want to feel or think what they want to think, and just be okay with that. And then, to parents, support your adoptee no matter what their journey is. If they want to do a birth parent search, great, support them. If they don't, great, support them. The biggest thing my parents did for me is just support me. And they never pushed me to do anything I did or didn't want to do in regards to my adoption. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Misty, is there anything else you have for Taylor?
No, but I just do want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and speak to our audience.
Thank you.
And Taylor, where can people find you on social media? All the platforms.
They can find me on TikTok with my username Taylor Raping Shen or on Instagram at Taylor Shennett.
And we'll share that link on our episode, which would probably drop mid-April. And the one thing I forgot to mention to my audience, and I keep getting reminded that subscribing to this YouTube show is so important. It does help support our pro bono cases. And Taylor, I don't know if you know this, we do a lot of pro bono, and we do giveaways for Mother's Day, and which is coming up. And obviously, when you know this, when people subscribe or follow you on your social media, you make money on the advertising, don't you? And the money that I make off this show, which isn't a lot, I use a lot of my own pocket. We support our pro bono cases, and that may involve someone from another country. And it's important that people do subscribe to the show because it does support our pro bono and keep this show going. And Misty, again, we're close to 4,000 followers for a niche YouTube show. And the more followers you have, the more support we have. And also, I'd like to tell our audience, keep those comments coming. We do have a lot of loyal followers and subscribers who always thank us for the content we have. And I'm sure they're going to thank Taylor for being here today. And again, I want to thank Taylor, Misty for being here. And I want to thank everyone for watching Finding Family DNA. And we'll see you next time.